When we think about asexual reproduction, vegetative reproduction comes to mind. All of these plants on the slide are able to grow new units from specialized structures. Garlic uses bulbs to grow new plants. Other plants can grow adventive roots from almost any green organ, as is the case with the leaf here. Ginger has underground roots, or rather thick stems, which are called rhizomes. Potatoes have tubers that can grow new stems from their islets. And strawberries have stolons, which are horizontal stems crawling on the ground that can spread the plant horizontally. All of these structures are capable of producing roots, and eventually the vegetative unit they produce can be severed from its original organism and continue existing on its own. It is tricky to distinguish vegetative reproduction, which can create new clonal individuals, from simple modular growth of the plants, where the plant increases its size by producing new units, but does not produce new clones that can live independently. According to their life cycle, plants can be separated in monocarpic and polycarpic species. Monocarpic species only flower once in their lifetime, and they can be annual or perennial species. Examples of monocarpic perennials include the bamboo and the yucca tree. During the vegetative period of their life cycle, which can be as long as 120 years in some bamboo species, these plants may reproduce asexually and accumulate a great deal of food material that will be required during their once-in-a-lifetime flowering and setting of seed after fertilization. But soon after flowering, these plants die. Monocarpic perennials are often considered to be reproducing via vegetative growth. For instance, a bamboo is notoriously known for being highly invasive and quickly conquering new territories, starting from a single planted shoot that can clonally reproduce and infest entire areas. Polycarpic plants form flowers many times during their lifetime. Fruit trees, such as apple and orange trees, are polycarpic. They flower every year. Other polycarpic species, such as perennials, flower several times during their lifespan, but not each year. Some polycarpic species, such as grasses, produce rhizome and tillers that can be separated from the maternal plant and start a new individual on their own. Thus, they're capable of clonal reproduction. Others, such as apple trees, produce branches, but these branches cannot exist on their own if they're cut off the maternal tree. That is, unless if they're grafted by an agriculture to another tree. Some asexual species reproduce via apomexis. Apomexis is asexual reproduction through seeds. Blueberries are typically apomictic plants. They produce a lot of seeds, but all of these seeds are genetically identical copies of their mother plant. To understand how and why apomixis occurs, we need to get familiarized with some of the terminology of plant sexual reproduction. The female gametophyte, also called megagametophyte, is enclosed in an ovule. At the origin of the megagametophyte is a single diploid cell called megasporocyte or mother cell. This megasporocyte undergoes a meiotic division and produces 4 haploid cells called megaspores. 3 of the megaspores will die, but the 4th will undergo several mitotic divisions to produce a total of 8 haploid cells. Of these 8 cells, the important is the egg cell that is going to produce the embryo, and the 2 polar cells, which are fused, so we have 1 cell with 2 nuclei in green on this illustration. Usually, for a plant to produce seeds, it needs to go pollination and double fertilization. When a pollen seed is deposited on the stigma of a flower, it will germinate a pollen tube that penetrates the ovule and carries two male gametes. One gamete will fertilize the egg, producing the embryo, and the other one will fertilize the polar cells, producing the endosperm, or reserve tissue of the seed, which will nourish the embryo during germination. Both of these fertilizations are required for the plant to produce a viable seed. In apomictic plants, the double fertilization by gametes brought by pollen is completely absent, and yet these species can produce a viable seeds. For apomixis to occur, three things need to happen. First, the genome of the egg cell should not be reduced. This can happen if the mother cell does not undergo meiosis, but instead it divides through a simple mitosis. Alternatively, instead of developing an embryo from an egg cell, a diploid cell of the nucellus, or the tissue that is protecting the embryo sac, here in yellow, can be induced to start dividing and develop into an embryo. But having diploid cells is not enough. They need to start dividing and form an embryo. This process is usually initiated by fertilization, or rather the fusion of the male and the female gametes in sexually reproducing plants. For apomixis to occur, the diploid cell needs to undergo parthenogenesis, namely the initiation of embryo development without fertilization. This is a complicated process that requires genetic and epigenetic modifications, which will deregulate parts of the cell cycle involved in embryogenesis. And lastly, the endosperm needs to be produced. Without viable endosperm, the embryo will not be able to develop into a seedling during germination because it will have no resources. Some apomictic plants thus have developed a partial fertilization strategy where only the polar cells are being fertilized by pollen. Others have developed the faculty to produce diploid endosperm. Apomixis requires the plants to invest energy into producing special reproductive structures, which are the flowers, even though it does not need to attract any pollen. Moreover, the whole process of evolution of this reproductive mode is quite complicated and requires a lot of adjustments of the gametogenesis and embryogenesis, which is quite risky. A wrong change of these processes can result in complete loss of reproductive functions of the plant. So why bother with evolving such a complex asexual strategy instead of simply resorting to vegetative asexual reproduction? We can get a hint for this in the fact that apomixis often occurs in polyploid plants, which have multiple sets of chromosomes. Imagine two plants that have different sets of chromosomes, but somehow have managed to produce a hybrid individual. This individual now has two sets of non-homologous chromosomes, which can differ in their number and structure. During the metaphase of meiosis, these chromosomes will try to align at the equatorial belt of the cell and pair up, but they cannot because they're not compatible. This will either abort the advancement of meiosis or will result in the production of unviable gametes. This problem can be partly solved if the hybrid doubles its genome and becomes a tetraaloploid. Allo means that it has sets of chromosomes that are non-homologous, obtained by the cross between two different species. This tetraploid hybrid could potentially produce viable gametes, but because of the different sets of chromosomes, some meiotic distortion can still occur. By recurring to asexual, apomictic reproduction, the plant could avoid meiosis altogether and all the risks associated with meiotic distortion of its weird karyotype. Moreover, it has been shown in several taxa of angiosperms that apomixis can be reversed, or it even co-occurs with sexual reproduction. So the polyploid plants still have the possibility to revert to sexual reproduction if they are able to solve the problems of meiotic distortion.